Okay, so welcome everybody to the June meeting of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network. This is going to be our last meeting until September. I am speaking to you from the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. Very grateful to live here and very much recognizing the debt that we have as settlers on this place, this currently ongoing colonized place. And I'm very pleased today that our speakers are going to be directly addressing this intimate relationship between internationalization and colonization, which is something that I think our field is increasingly recognizing as an important issue to address, but we don't usually do it in direct ways, perhaps because we don't know how to go about it. So our speakers are going to sort of offer an example of how we might do that, which is really great. So the plan is that I will introduce our speakers. They will give their talk, and then we will open it up for questions and conversations. I also wanted to highlight that the talk today is based on an article that was recently published in a special issue of the Journal of International Students that I co-edited with Dr. Dale McCartney, who is here, and I'll put the info for that special issue in the chat at some point so that you can access the related article and the other articles in the issue. It's open access. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Marcia Leenen-Young and Dr. Siriana Naepi. Dr. Leenen-Young is a lecturer in Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland. Her major research interests lie in the areas of Pacific history, decolonization, and Pacific pedagogies. Dr. Siriana Naepi is a lecturer in the sociology department at the University of Auckland. Her major research interests lie in the area of higher education, Pacific peoples, equity, and knowledge construction. So with that, I will hand them the floor.
Nisa Mbulavanaka, we're joining we're joining you today from the lands of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, which the University of Auckland is not only built on, but a lot of our campus was built from land gifted to the university from the government that was not theirs to gift. And we're also presenting from Marcia's office, which is located within the Beauty Whale Pasifika complex. And when you make it to Aotearoa, I will make sure to show you the whale and show off the wonderful architecture and some beautiful, it's truly a beautiful building. And I'm slightly jealous that Mars gets to hang out there all the time. So today we were going to talk to you a little bit casually about a paper that we produced for Sharon and Dale's special issue. And we're genuinely quite grateful for this opportunity. Marcia and I don't get the opportunity to work together a lot in our respective fields and to bring it together. And we sort of hung this paper on the idea of which some of you have worked with me before. It's not a new metaphor to use, but the idea of trying to weave a map about critical internationalization, the Pacific, and colonization. And the image that you can see now on your screen is my 21st map. And so that 21st map was woven by my bumbu in Naita City, and it is an art form that we kind of, as New Zealand-based Pacific people, we get gifted them a lot. And she has had to weave that by hand, and it's a huge mat. It fills about 5 meters by 5 meters. And we're using that as an idea to think about how we bring the different strands together. And as we sort of go through this presentation, hopefully you'll recognize the different strands and see where we maybe struggled, but where we were also able to build quite strong pieces.
Talo whalawa, ulo'u ingo o Marcia Leenen-Young, ulo'u tina i sa mai manua, Marcia Leola, ulo'u tama i sa mai Limburg in Holland. Talo for everyone. Thank you, Sharon, so much for the invitation to come and talk. We've been talking for a while now about what we're going to do in this, and we decided that we were going to start in our traditional way by sharing a little bit of ourselves. So on the screen, you can see really kind of my history, all those components that make me who I am. You have at the top my Dutch grandparents who immigrated to New Zealand separately and met here within the Dutch community and got married and had my father. And then at the bottom you have my Samoan grandparents who lived in Samoa until the 1950s, the mid 1950s, where they moved here with my mother, who was 11 at the time. And then up here you have my family, and this is me when I was a child. I love showing embarrassing photos of myself. This is my father, my mother, my sister, and my younger brother. And that is kind of the family unit that's determined so much for me moving forward and making decisions, I think, to do what I do today. And here is my PhD graduation, and my little nieces, my sister's 2 children, and they're kind of like, I don't know, the rock that I build everything upon. I don't have children myself, so they are my babies. A little bit about my academic background. I actually have a PhD in ancient history. So I wrote a PhD on a 2nd century BC Greek writer who wrote about Roman imperialism. So I've got unusual background for someone who works in Pacific studies and teaches Pacific history. I did the rare thing that most people can't do, and I changed disciplines. So I'm currently teaching Pacific history and Pacific studies, and my focus, my specialization is on the period of decolonization, 1950s, 1960s in New Zealand and the Pacific. But I've had a really good opportunity in writing this paper with Sienna to kind of delve into the history of education in the Pacific, which is now probably something that I'm going to pursue a little bit further. So yeah, it's been a really good ride, this article. Yeah.
Nisan Bulvanaka, my name is Siriana Naepi. I'm named after my great-grandmother who raised my mother in the village of Nakinda in Naita City in Fiji. Naepi is my husband's last name, so his family are Niuean and they're from Awasali and Tamakatonga. A little bit about me, I guess. My 2 daughters on the left are named after the matriarchy and the patriarchy collectively. So poor Alice has the matriarchy on her shoulders, no pressure, but she has her great-grandmother's name, her grandmother's name, and her bumbu's name. And Mackenzie has the patriarchy, so she's named after her grandfather, her great-grandfather, and then we also kind of slipped in my mentor there, but we won't talk about that. She's the one I really wish that she would mimic. But we continued that tradition of recognizing our ancestral lines and naming. My husband's in the middle. Those of you who know me, who did PhD work with me in UBC, understand how much my ability to sit here and casually chat to you about this work is dependent on his support. So I do think it's important to hold space for just someone who's given up a lot so that I could have a lot. And then on the right is my PhD graduation. I did my PhD at UBC in Educational Studies. I never crossed the stage at UBC. Instead, my mentor, Professor Aidini, brought her UBC robes from Canada to Auckland so that I could celebrate with my family in the backyard of Mount Wellington. So she's on the left there, and then Professor Rod McCormick, who some of you will know, was also quite significant in my time in Canada. And then 2 Māori scholars there. The one on the right is Graham Hingaroa Smith, who gave me hope while I was in Canada. On the bottom is my great-grandmother, Alice, my grandmother, who is Alice's great-grandmother, who came from England and met my grandfather during the war. And there's a sneaky story that involves trains sneaking into bases and not being allowed out for a first date with a man she didn't like, that she later married and moved to New Zealand for. And then on the right is a bit more of my extended family. So my dad's in there, my 2 brothers are in there, my bumbu's in there, my aunties are in there, my cousins are in there. And that is actually outside the Whare Pacifica for my daughter's first birthday, that when it was going to rain in Auckland, the Whare Pacifica crew here said, it's okay, you can have that building with 2 days notice. So to give you an idea of what it means to be at home, I guess, in this space. And the Whare Pacifica is not just an academic building, it is a place where people have PhD graduations, a place where people have first birthdays, a place where we welcome dignitaries, a place where we give lectures. It is truly a communal space that sometimes, as the university says, is the spiritual home of the Pacific, and other times, as those of you who study higher ed know, it's definitely some beautiful window dressing. Right?
Yeah, both.
Yeah, cool. It's both. One and the same. Sorry, I went for a bit. So Mas and I are an interesting pairing. So we're a historian and a social scientist who probably never would have crossed paths in the way we did if it wasn't for a program called Tōkana Arts here, which is a mentoring program for Māori and Pacific. So Mas and I have known each other for longer than I've known my husband, actually. Like 15 years. So like 15 years. So she hates the story, so I'm going to tell it, but she made me read my master's thesis out loud, word by word. Marcia has been a rock for a lot of the Pacific Academy here, but also since coming home is the person I come and sit in her office and just complain about being a Pacific academic once a week. And so this article was a really interesting way for us to move from weekly coffees ranting about the institution to how can we take our different academic skills and apply it to the same question. And the question we wanted to ask was the role of international education in the Pacific. And what does it look like when a historian addresses that question? What does it look like when a social scientist addresses that question? And how do we talk to each other and create a narrative? And one of the things that's come out of this conversation is my realization that as a social scientist, I can't do this work without the historians. Which makes Amasia very happy. Which Dale may have laid the groundwork for that very early on. You're benefiting from rants from Dale at UBC. But this photo was from last week when I wore my PhD gowns for the first time, and we got to sit on the same stage that Beyonce danced, no big deal. But we got to sit at the University of Auckland graduation ceremony and watch Pacific students cross the stage and kind of realize that it was a moment. And this has been a year of moments, a moment of publishing together, a moment of being able to have weekly coffees together, moments of being able to present together and to sit on the stage together. So that's a little bit of a background as to how this article came about, because I don't think it is an article we would normally have written individually. Yeah,
and it wasn't necessarily smooth sailing either. We've got very different disciplinary backgrounds and very different kind of practices, and there were points where Siriana just kind of had to let me run for it and do all of the research I could and write pages and pages, and then she would softly say to me, we can't include all of that. You need to decide what you need. So there were many moments like that where I kind of just, had to be reined in a little bit. And and kind of framing it within the higher education research as well was a really interesting process for me, and having to discuss that together, and then what kind of evidence we could pick from history in the Pacific to kind of support what we were arguing. So it wasn't always smooth sailing. It was a process, but it was one that was really valuable.
And I do think that there was value as well when Marcia would kind of say, you can't just make that sweeping statement. We have to go to the archives and find the thing that lets you make the sweeping statement. And so a lot of archive work, I think, went into that on Marcia's behalf. And there is something magical about working across disciplines. To make we think it's quite an important point for not just internationalization studies, but also for Pacific research, to have that conversation, to critically engage with what the gift of New Zealand education really means. Cool.
Do you want to talk about reviewers?
Oh, yes, sorry. We also need to acknowledge, so we had 2 anonymous reviewers, so thank you, Sharon and Dale, for organising that, but we also felt it was important to have 3 Pacific reviewers. So we had one of the biggest names in Pacific history, really. Damon Salesa looked over it because he loves Marcia. And we also had David Fa'avai, who is a big name in Pacific higher ed here. And he rightly pointed out that that we needed to think about development and higher ed, and some of the critiques coming out of development education. And then Katie, who is a rising star, she was pretty amazing and had a look through it too.
Yeah, and her great great aunt was the person who really started writing on education in Pacific and New Zealand. So it was quite, I don't know, it was quite nice having her involved in it as well. And she's, yeah, she's one of our Rhodes Scholars, so she's on the way to study in Oxford now. We should probably say that there's going to be some noise in the background because we have a construction site right next to the whale.
It's my old building, yeah. And they've kicked us out of my old building, and now I exist in open plan offices. So yay for the future of academia. I was promised an office and now I have a desk, which is why I'm in Masia's office all the time.
Yes. Okay.
So we also wanted to sort of touch on the idea of Pendant Sleeves. So Pendant Sleeves are the leaves that you gather and you dry and you split to make beautiful mats. So the mat that you saw isn't even, it's not a fine mat, it's a pretty standard mat, but you can see how big the leaves are when they're gathered, and then they have to be split for weaving. And we wanted to sort of think about that idea of which leaves or which threads are we bringing in. And when we thought about it, it was a little bit of my critical university studies space. Mas obviously brought her Pacific history. There was the wider colonial histories to think about. So the time away from the Pacific gave me scope to think about wider colonial objectives and methods and how we could see patterns of that in the Pacific as well. And then also it's really important to, sometimes it's not always obvious if you're from outside of the Pacific, but Matia and I are New Zealand born Pacific, which is a very specific history. So a lot of our communities moved over for labour, to fill a labour gap, until the government got bored of us and then proceeded to have dawn raids where they would, the Pacific would blame for the lack of jobs in New Zealand. And we know that that historically is not accurate as usual. And it also means that we have been, the lessons that we know about being Pacific, I understand the value of a mat. I understand when we present mats, I understand that the process, but I've never had to make a mat. And I think that that is sort of the line we want to draw, is that being New Zealand born means we understand cultural values, but we haven't always had to participate in the making of those cultural values. And that shifts how we talk about and think about the Pacific. And it also means that our thinking is slightly different. So we look at the same information, but perhaps come out with something else. And then also being aware that that sort of muddying of what does it mean to be New Zealand born Pacific, speaking about the Pacific, because we are speaking about ancestral ties, but we're also in a relatively privileged position working at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, not working at the University of the South Pacific. Yeah, so all of those sort of complications and things that we really do want to ask you to hold when you engage with this, because there are people in the Pacific who do similar work that also need to be spotlighted, I think, that we tried to in the beginning. But yeah, anything to add on that one?
No, I'll go back. Okay, so in the article that we wrote, we began exploring how international education kind of operates as a tool through which old colonial powers assert their dominance over former colonies. We focused on New Zealand's historical empire in the Pacific, and I just wanted to cover what that was. So in 1901, New Zealand colonized the Cook Islands and Niue, and in 1914, within weeks of the outbreak of World War I, they seized Samoa, and then in 1926, they were also given the mandate to annex Tokelau in 1926. Also, we do use the word empire, and the word empire is not one that is kind of standardly used when we are talking about New Zealand's colonial territory in the Pacific. And we use this because that's been coined by Damon Salisa. So this is the way that he refers to this territory, because of New Zealand's clear imperial ambitions in building up to amassing territory. And this is also not a history that is commonly known in New Zealand. I've been in spaces where I've referred to New Zealand's territories in the Pacific as an empire and literally been scoffed at by other academics. So the term empire is not one that's standardly accepted, but one that Pacific historians use. and the idea of New Zealand as a colonizer, apart from the obvious colonization of New Zealand as a colonizer within the Pacific, is also not one that is widely accepted. Also, in writing this article, we had to stretch the boundaries a bit on what we considered international education. So we could include European-based education systems that were introduced into the Pacific as a result of colonization. And we did this because the implanted colonial education framework has created a system where international education is valued above that offered within the Pacific itself. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on three key aspects that we focus on in the article. There's a lot more in the article, but we picked three key things to discuss internationalization of education in the Pacific. The first is education as a gift to Indigenous peoples. The second is legislation for international education. And the last one is the fostering of individualization by colonial powers. And then we're going to briefly talk at the end about where this conversation could go or where we would like it to potentially go, which is the same way that we ended the article with saying, you know, this is a conversation that needs to be continued. We're also going to attempt to present together as we've been doing. So I'm going to cover the history parts, and Siriana is then going to analyze the story and apply it to internationalization of education. But as you've just seen in the previous few minutes, there are going to be probably a little bit of bumps along the way. So bear with us as we try and meld our two disciplines together and practices together. Okay. So when we talk about the Pacific, we're talking about many different peoples over a vast space of ocean, connected by ancestral ties in spite of geographical distance. So Europeans entered the Pacific in different ways to thriving societies that were already built on Indigenous knowledge systems, as we all know, to a people who had a real thirst for knowledge. And we know this through the incredibly sudden and dramatic introduction of the written word to the Pacific. So with the arrival of the missionaries in the Pacific, education no longer became community-based, and it became a gift offered in order to spread the word of God and civilize the heathens of the Pacific, So the gift of education was to humanize an infant-like people associated, well, identified by Europeans who arrived. Learning and Pacific people's desire for education, though, was dangled as a benefit for social and structural change that was pushed by Europeans. And Pacific people really wanted to read and write. We see this in many ways in the Pacific. But the clearest way that we can see it is the speed with which access to the Bible was made available in the Pacific by the very early missionaries. Now, the speed was almost incredible. Within 13 years of missionaries arriving in Samoa, there was a complete translation of the New Testament in Samoan. So within 13 years, they had produced that. And that takes into account having to create new words to identify the language differences. So it's an incredible feat. So in the Pacific, particularly in these first islands in Samoa, for example, education is entwined really strong with Christianity. And LMS, the London Missionary Society, did recognize this in 1910 when they did say, well, when they admitted that education really was the tool for conversion in the Pacific. And for Pacific peoples, they doors to the rest of the world. And for missionaries and colonists, exposure to Western forms of education was part of the gift of civilization, and then in opposition, the vilification of Indigenous knowledges. And this can be seen really clearly in the demands that the New Zealand government received from Niue and the Cook Islands once they annexed in 1901. In Niue in 1906, the Niue Council complained to the New Zealand resident commissioner on the island that the New Zealand government couldn't even provide a school teacher. And this is what we have on the PowerPoint, the Niue Council's formal complaint in 1906. And in Niue, in order to educate their population, they actually themselves raised money. They raised money for land, they raised money to build a building so that they could educate their people. So this is how important education was to Niue, how important fostering Western education in Niue was once New Zealand had colonised. And in Samoa in 1915, less than a year after New Zealand had seized Samoa from the Germans, the superintendent of schools of New Zealand actually went over to Samoa and they opened the first secular school. So within 1 year, which was also quite amazing. And they had a flood of applicants and they only had 60 places. So they could only really cater to a very small part of the population, real thirst for knowledge and a real demand for education. But after this, the New Zealand administration in Samoa, in the Cook Islands, in Niue, admitted that they could not manage the demand from Pacific people for education. So they went back to the missionaries and really relied on them to educate the people of these Pacific islands. And this is really something that continues until 1950. So until 1950, missionary education is still a factor in the Pacific. And this shows how effective early missionaries had been in these parts of the Pacific, in New Zealand's little empire in the Pacific, to paint colonization as a gift and education as a gift to be desired and pursued in order to access the outside world.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting because we see a number of Indigenous academics speak about knowledge as a gift, and so in my own culture and Fijian culture, knowledge is a gift. So when you give someone knowledge, it's framed as a gifting, and so you can see how quickly and easy it was to take the gifting. Like if you introduce a new knowledge system, you can see how easily it can be turned into the idea of a gift, and a gift is something to be treasured, right? And so you can see why there's a thirst for knowledge and a desire to engage with these new knowledge systems. Where it becomes a problem is where the colonizers kind of went, cool, now we're going to use your Indigenous understandings of knowledge to basically replace your own knowledge systems. Mm-hmm. So we're giving you a gift and it needs to be valued above and beyond your own knowledge systems. And in order for you to access the other things that we have, so in order for you to access our other technologies, our other land, travel, so, for instance, Niue had quite, and still has quite a significant depopulation issue where people leave the island, and that was really clear quite early on that was happening, because this desire to continue a pattern of accessing the globe. Pacific peoples were, Hawafo, one of our big scholars, talks about how Pacific peoples were engaged in globalization before globalization was a thing, right? We constantly traveled, we constantly explored, we constantly went to the next horizon. And so when people arrive and say, we have a new knowledge system, we have a new world to offer you, of course, the sort of next step is to want to engage quite deeply in that. And so we see what happens with that gift of education is you see what De Sousa talks about, which is the abyss, right? Where everything on that other side of the abyss and Pacific knowledges becomes unknowable again. So in order to enter the missionary school, in order to enter the New Zealand government school, all of the other knowledge that you know needs to be unknowable. You cannot bring that to this side of the abyss. And that process, we see Pacific knowledge systems devalued and made invisible, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of that today. And I think we talked a little bit about how that gift was sort of this cognitive leap that meant that not only did the colonizers devalue Pacific knowledges, but it meant that Pacific people began to as well. And the ramifications of that we're going to, I think, talk through in the next slide, which is now that you've convinced the population that Pacific knowledge is not valuable, how do you then, what's another lever, I guess, to pull on to make sure that Indigenous knowledges just disappear, really? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, the history part again, a little bit. So one way that I would describe New Zealand's administration of her Pacific colonies when they took control around 1901 is completely ad hoc. New Zealand really had no plan and didn't know what they were doing. And their policies towards education between 1900 and 1950 really show this kind of ad hoc nature. It's really dependent by who's in government in New Zealand. and it's really dependent on the beliefs of those on the ground. So within each of the Pacific territories within the empire, there was a resident commissioner, and it really did determine, well, it really was based on what the resident commissioner believed was appropriate in terms of education. So in 1905, the New Zealand government did actually decide it was time to take responsibility for education in the Pacific, and they were intending to apply the New Zealand Education Act to its colonies. So they were going to extend this policy, legislating who should be educated within each of these islands. Now, the representatives of the New Zealand government in the Pacific, as I said, in the Cook Islands in particular is the one that I'm going to be talking about, didn't really think that this was a priority and opposed the spreading or the inclusion of this act in the territories, because they didn't really think it was necessary to develop education beyond the already existing kind of scanty missionary structure. And as you can see on the quote on the slide, which is a technique of historians to put quotes on slides from archives, there is a quote there from the New Zealand Resident Commissioner in the Cook Islands, Walter Gudgeon, who recognised that the system of education was inadequate, but didn't think it was worth spending any money on. And this attitude really dominates, at least, well, significantly, the first 10 years of colonial rule in the Cook Islands and in Niue both at the same time. Now, Gudgeon is an interesting character because he really believed in fatal impact theory as well, and his administrative policies show his belief that eventually Indigenous peoples within the Pacific would die out. And so his concern really is to build a society within these within the Pacific territory that he was in charge of, that could be taken over quite easily by Europeans. And we see this in his education policies, and we see this in his policies towards land as well. And so for him, primitive minds of those of the Pacific only really needed the basics of education to allow them to access the main occupation of life within the Pacific, which was farming and cultivating the soil. And there is the appendices to the parliamentary discussions show this over and over and over again between 1901 and about 1912, 1911. So in 1911, New Zealand again attempts to recognise its responsibility towards the Pacific, and they sent the inspector of the native schools out to all of their territories because they believed what had worked for Māori would work for Pacific due to our shared ancestry. And this is a common theme that we get in discussions about the Pacific and about Māori, is that we have ancestral connections, so what worked for one would work for the other. But this was based off the very wrong idea that the New Zealand government managed Māori and had successful race relations, which is something New Zealand did foster an international reputation on quite early. So that's kind of based on this. And so in 1911, when the native schools, the inspector for native schools went to the Cook Islands and to Niue, he proposed that education should be compulsory for everyone up to 14 within these Pacific territories. And then after that, if there was any higher education, they would need to be sent to New Zealand. And this proposal was accepted unanimously between the Cook Islands and New Zealand and Niue. And so begins this idea that travel is necessary if you want more than basic exposure to education. In 1926, the New Zealand...
Sorry, cut out for a minute.
In 1926, when New Zealand's empire was at the largest with the addition of Tokelau, Wellington again decided that they were going to get serious about education, and they decided that they were going to have a conference on curriculum. No Pacific people attended. This was a conference of New Zealand representatives deciding what was best for the Pacific. And they focused largely on primary education and the establishment of like menial kind of subjects within the Pacific. So curriculum was a really big focus on this. But even after this conference, there's really no discussion on secondary education in the Pacific itself. And this isn't standard until the 1950s. So in the post-World War II boom, when you get more awareness of colonization and the impacts of colonization, you do have New Zealand fostering secondary school education in the Pacific, but this is completely self-serving because at this point, New Zealand is concerned with providing labour for their markets, and they need people who are educated to the level necessary to be able to work in New Zealand. So that is a key motivator for New Zealand setting up secondary education within the Pacific. And post-World War II, despite the boom in Pacific secondary education, the idea of travelling to New Zealand for education beyond primary school was still there. And it's kind of cemented in Pacific society from this point onwards.
Yeah, so this, I think the history that Marcy has just shared is a really important piece to understanding why Pacific peoples would continue to engage in international education and international higher education. And so this, you basically, it starts off with you can't access anything beyond the age of 14. So we're talking about higher ed, but really it's beyond the age of 14. You cannot access anything unless you come to New Zealand. And that really early on, when you pair that with the devaluing of Indigenous knowledge systems, you have this understanding that a good education can only happen outside of the Pacific. So Alistair probably would kill me. New Zealand is part of the Pacific, but a good education can only happen if you leave your home island. And so this piece around what does it mean if you're growing up in the Pacific and people leave to go get an education, then they get a good job. And a good job here in the 50s was working in a factory in New Zealand, right? That continued. So even though you're leaving to get an international education, it's not actually to access the good jobs at this point. Not good jobs by Pākehā standards, good jobs by you are getting a New Zealand dollar that can be sent home. And so this really complicated economic mess really plays into this because Pacific have a small economy as a result of colonization and stripping of resources. And then in order to access the bigger economy, you need to leave and get an education in a bigger economy so that you can then earn money from there to send it back to your smaller economy. So very few in the beginning, I guess, would the idea of returning home. A lot of the scholarships that we're going to talk about next has a return home clause because a lot of Pacific people don't return home. They weren't returning home. And it's quite interesting when you think about internationalization in regards to sort of the traditional sense of internationalization in higher education and how that's deeply tied to visas. For the Pacific, particularly for Tokelau and Niue and the Cook Islands, they don't need a New Zealand visa. They are New Zealand citizens. So they are leaving to come, and they're not counted as an international education system here because of that colonial history, but they are international. All of these little threads, I guess, are the things that we were discussing over the months that we were writing this, is what does this all mean? And ultimately what it sort of meant that New Zealand legislated education systems in the Pacific in a way that meant we had to engage in international education. If you cannot get an education past 14 and you want to engage in it in the international economic system, then you had to leave. And in some ways, I think there's really interesting parallels to how that works today, which might be another paper. There may be some of you want to write with us. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a quote on the PowerPoint again, the bottom one, which is by Thomas Babington Macaulay, who's a noted British imperialist and historian, who is credited with being the first man to take Western education to India. And this quote is horrendous, but also really kind of compelling in the argument. And we can see here that education is clearly a tool for colonial control through its focus on individuals and its focus on educating individuals in Western ways to then be used to go back home and create these Indigenous elites that are used to, again, be vehicles to perpetuate these colonial ideas. And this is a new practice. Missionaries did this worldwide. They did this starting with, educating Indigenous teachers, not calling them missionaries, calling them teachers, and sending them out to spread the word of God to their own people. So this isn't new. colonization takes up the same practice within the Pacific. And we see this through the sponsorship of promising young Pacific people sent to New Zealand for education in order to have more opportunities outside their homes and for access to the valued Western systems of knowledges. And at its heart, the system really is based on the conviction by the colonial government that Pacific people capable of excelling in Western education were few and far between. And that a comprehensive Pacific-based system of education wasn't needed in the Pacific because of this. It was cheaper to educate people by sending them to New Zealand rather than setting up a system on the home islands. So this is not a system that New Zealand sets up to respond to the educational needs of their territories within the empire. It is a system that is cheaper and easier for New Zealand, but one decided by New Zealand policymakers without any consideration of Pacific peoples. So the scholarship scheme, which we'll be talking about a little bit, was first suggested as early as 1904, which is incredible considering it was only 3 years beforehand that New Zealand annexed the Cook Islands and Niue. Before any attempt to regulate any kind of secular education within the Pacific, the idea of the scholarship scheme came up. And even though the idea was posed early, it's not until after World War I that the scholarship schemes actually start. In the Cook Islands, it starts from 1919. In Samoa, it starts a year later. And these students are sent to St. Stephen's Māori College in Auckland. So again, we have these Pacific students being sent to a school that is catered that caters for Māori students. So it has the same kind of ideas about the intellectual capabilities of Pacific people. And while the scheme was suspended in World War II, it kicks up really soon after peace terms. So again, this kind of sees the priority of New Zealand to get this kind of pipeline going between the Pacific and educate those they believed were capable of.
Yeah, and we see it. So the scholarship scheme today still exists where the government selects high achieving or well-connected, i.e. related individuals to come to New Zealand and do and participate in our university system. For instance, the University of Auckland has a Public Policy Institute, and the Public Policy Institute has one of the most diverse master's programs I've ever seen. And it's because a lot of them are Pacific students who have been sent over with government funding that's usually been given by New Zealand to the Pacific government to then pay for Pacific students to come to New Zealand to engage in our higher education system with the very sort of, it's not even, I guess, a casual point. It's literally because we believe that our education system can teach them good governance versus their own education systems. And so that's where we kind of pulled on Grossvogel, and that idea of internationalization in higher ed is really just about continuing the colonial project and taking individuals, training them in Western values and systems, teaching them again that it's better to then send them home so they can implement government and education systems that continue that cycle and really embed a cycle where we won't see Pacific knowledge systems valued in the same way that they were before colonial projects. And in the article, we talk a little bit about resistance to this. It's not completely fatal. There is Pacific resistance to these spaces, but it's really interesting to see a policy, an institute set up, and a big part of their revenue is training Pacific in good governance, and they run government programs too. So they run like seminar series that Pacific governments pay money to participate in, so they can learn transparent governance, because that's a very real concern for New Zealand, is that Pacific people don't know how to govern their own people in a transparent way, which is bullshit. Some of it's true, some of it's not. But I do think
Just talking about Samoa, that's why I'm laughing.
Just saying, these guys still don't have a prime minister. We might have had 3 coups, but these guys still don't have a prime minister. So I do think there is something to be said about that really early disconnection of Pacific peoples from Indigenous knowledges in a really purposeful way, then the legislating of an international education system that means that Pacific people, if they want to rise, not only internationally, but within our own islands, if you want to be someone of influence, you need to leave. And some of the PhD students here will be like, oh, those feels, because you need to leave. So to come home and be influential, you need to leave. There's no, the gift of a New Zealand education is valued above and beyond anything you can get in the Pacific. And that in itself is, that I guess that's the conversation we wanted to bring into the internationalization space. And I know it's a conversation that's happening in other spaces as well, but what we kind of wanted to think a little bit about, what does it mean for a colonial power to hold that much power in an education system? Not on the land, right? Because as Marcia was saying earlier, Pacific, when you talk about the New Zealand Empire, people either don't believe you or they don't know it's a thing. Right? They genuinely, I think when Jacinda Ardern, our current Prime Minister, visited Niue, people were freaking out about it and saying it was this jaunt without realizing that Niue is part of the New Zealand Empire. We're part of the New Zealand state. So the fact that we hadn't visited, I think it was for like 10 years or something, but like the fact that the Prime Minister hadn't visited for 10 years was probably a problem as opposed to a problem that she was visiting. And so these are the sorts of conversations we wanted to open up that we think opens up a different space in international students conversation and internationalization in higher ed. But we also think that we are opening our conversation in Pacific studies that some of us are perhaps hesitant to have. We're not going to lie, we were kind of happy that we didn't have to do this presentation first to Pacific community, because we're prepared to, you'll see that in the article, we talk about development education. So we're prepared to critique the narrative of development, but we're not prepared to critique the role of colonization in that development. And part of that is tied to the Pacific was never colonized, that narrative, which is a lie. And it's a source of pride for some Pacific that we were never colonized, but it's just simply not true. And then I might be ranting a little bit here, so do kick me if I'm losing track here. But these are like, we really genuinely, once we started talking about this article, we were like, there's so much to talk about, but there's also so little work done in bringing these conversations together. And so we wanted to, I think this is the first article of many for us, where we work out how can we have these conversations about colonization, education, the Pacific, and internationalization. What can we take from the sociology of education, from a critical historian's knowledge, and what narratives can we create that need to be told? Because the narrative of the scholarship scheme is a narrative that needs to be told. It's not just giving us a gift. It's a gift that's very much tied to the idea that it gives, one of the points we wanted to make is that it's a gift that gives New Zealand power in the wider global scheme, because now New Zealand is the entry to the Pacific, and with the Pacific pivot and the Pacific step up and the Pacific, all the Pacific things, because we're scared of China, is kind of the very casual way of saying it. But this is what gives New Zealand power on the international stage, is that they can intervene in the Pacific because of traditional relationships, but we're not willing to say that those traditional relationships are built on colonization, and that the people in power in the Pacific were educated in New Zealand. And that's why we're quite happy to go along with what the New Zealand government has to say. But I think I might leave it there. Do you have anything to add to that? Yeah. You good? Questions, thoughts? Who wants to come hang out with us? We're fun. You can meet in person. You can come to New Zealand and meet in person.
Oh, that's
that was
me.
Thank you so much. It was really delightful to have such a presentation that was not just collaborative, and not just that you were actually physically there together, but really a conversation between you all, and very clear that the relationship you have and are continuing to build is really informing the work itself, which is always refreshing and different for the kind of siloed Western style of academia. So thank you very much for like showing us what's possible and doing it like with laughter, which is also difficult to do. Like, how can you laugh while talking about colonialism? But if we don't laugh, like, too much, right? So thank you very much for bringing that to the group. And I will defer to everyone else before I ask my questions, because I don't want to abuse my power as the moderator. So anyone who would like to go first, please go ahead. Dale, go ahead.
I have a lot of questions.
I was like, no, not Dale. Dale's.
I have two questions maybe I'll ask now, and then we can dig into other ones. And they're both big, so you can choose what to do with them. One of them is about your discussion of, you talked about the idea of Pacifica teachers, like people who were placed in between or drawn into this role between the missionary system and the and like indigenous populations. And because this is a strategy, of course, missionaries used everywhere. And there's sort of a literature on the northwest coast of North America that the people who took up this role, I'm thinking particularly of a man named Arthur Wellington Claw, who left a diary, like a 50-year diary, that gave us this tremendous amount of insight into what he saw himself as doing. And he really positioned himself as mitigating the harms of colonialism. So like saw himself not necessarily, he recognized that what he was doing was translating for the missionary he worked for was a guy named William Duncan. So he recognized he was translating for Duncan, but he also felt that he was protecting Tsimshian, his like nation's people, from the worst elements of Duncan's teachings. And I was wondering if you had a thought about, is there sort of a syncretic role there? Is there resistance that looks like accommodation, if that makes sense? Maybe let's just leave it at that question, then I'll ask you the other question later, because the other question is so different. So
lots of different experiences, of course, throughout the Pacific. But when we're talking about, particularly in New Zealand's Pacific Empire, in Samoa and in the Cook Islands, the way that Christianity was embraced was 100% wholesale. And we have, like, early in the Cook Islands, this is where we start having the early Christian colleges. In the early 1800s, I think 1830 is the first one built in the Cook Islands. In Samoa, there's one built in 1844 to kind of pump out these indigenous teachers to spread throughout the Pacific. But I'm not aware of any kind of writings that talks in that way of protecting indigenous peoples. Is very much spreading the word of God and saving. That's very much the narrative as far as I'm aware. Yeah,
I think it's that interesting piece that Marcia has come to about early on, right? That thirst for knowledge. And when I think we think about it in the broader context of how Pacific peoples, turns out we went all the way to Antarctica apparently, but Pacific people's desire to keep moving to the next horizon. And so when these people arrive, by the way, we showed them how to get there. Cook was useless. We literally had to hire a navigator. He had a GPS system, and it was sponsored by the Royal Society. So those initial interactions, I think, when Alice de Ponga has a beautiful story where she talks about once we're Pacific in relations to Māori, the first time Māori interact not with Cook but with Tupia. I've said that really bad. Tupia. Yeah. With Tupia, who was Cook's navigator, and there's a picture drawn of Cook giving Māori a piece of masi or tapa or bark cloth in return for a piece of crayfish, and that she outlines the significance of that moment, because masi and tapa was a connection back to the Pacific, that they couldn't grow the plant needed to make masi and tapa in Aotearoa, so it had to come from the Pacific, and that in itself was a form of knowledge. Like masi and tapa is where we keep our knowledge, it's keep our stories, and so that arrival, I think that in itself is like a story of that arrival not being one of initial violence, but being one of an opening of another knowledge system. And so Pacific people's desire to be part of that new knowledge system reflected in the fact that we do journey to the next horizon. So this was just seen as another knowledge system. I think there's really interesting moments, particularly I think with your island in terms of the coming of Samoa, or the coming of Christianity, and that it was predicted, right? So this really interesting tying in of this introduced knowledge system to traditional knowledge systems, to indigenous knowledge systems, that just kind of meant that it wasn't the harm, I don't know, like it wasn't. But then also Fiji had this moment where we have one of our chiefs was called a gift from God because he went to Oxford and he learned what was happening, and he came back and introduced the law that you could not sell indigenous land, because he saw what was happening and was like, oh shit, came back and said, do not let them buy anything. And Niue's experience was
similar.
That the New Zealand government was like, don't talk to Niueans about buying land. They're 150 years behind the rest of Polynesia. They think we're just here to steal their land, which was interesting because it would turn out that Niueans knew exactly what was happening.
There was definitely resistance, though.
Yeah.
That's one thing of course there was resistance. But Pacific societies in general are really hierarchical societies. So once the kind of people at the top of the hierarchy were taken by Christianity, then it spread really fast.
Yeah.
It was kind of, and there's a really good story about the King of Tonga. So Tonga was really resistant to Christianity for a long time. And then the King of Tonga all of a sudden wanted to learn how to read and write. So he captured a sailor, essentially, and made him start to teach him to read and write on the beach by using a stick to draw in the sand. And from that little taste, he wanted to be better and better at it and grow his knowledge. And so he accepted Christianity as a way to kind of get more knowledge. And that's how Christianity becomes so prevalent in Tonga itself, because once the king has converted, then everyone else is expected to convert. So yeah, it's kind of, and there's all very different districts and stuff like that, even within Pacific countries. So all kind of, the stories are all different. Yeah.
I think that's a good question, Dale, and I think Matthew's going to go to the archives and try to find a journal. I think that's what's going to happen with this.
Oh yeah, I'm going to go and read John Williams' journal of 200 pages. Yeah.
You got RSL coming up. What was your second question, Dale?
I don't want to take too much time. I don't know if other of you have questions, but my other question was about the making of the article, actually. And you alluded to at the start of the challenges of being historians and social scientists trying to work together. And as a historian who feels like constantly social scientists don't know what I'm talking about, and most of the time I don't know what social scientists are talking about either, or why they think their data is so important. Anyways, yeah, well, I have a hard time. It is a challenge I've been thinking about a lot, like how to explain what we're doing, because I don't know how to do it. And so I wanted to ask about those tensions and about like what you found. What did you like? What was hard about it, and what did you learn from it?
I think the fact that we had an established relationship was good, because we could tease each other. So the tradition of teasing in the Pacific is quite an established tradition.
That's why we laugh.
Yeah. You show someone you love them by teasing them. And so in those moments of like, I was able to tease Marcia about her need to include 20 examples, and at the same time she was able to tease me about my need to just kind of make these grand sweeping statements with no evidence, or like not no evidence. It was and I think as a process it was quite interesting. We just kind of did it on a Google Doc and would go back, and we also write differently. Marcia is like super precise and cannot bring like Marcia. So for instance, this is Marcia's prep for the presentation, and this is mine, right? So it's not just discipline training, it's actually in how we engage and how we do our scholarship. So the way we do our scholarship was fundamentally different too. And I think the tough points were where there was disciplinary disagreement about what counted as evidence, what counted, what lenses to use, what can we say colonization? Should we say empire? Should we say neo-colonization? Should we say, are we going to discuss decolonization? What those different words mean in different spaces within the university, like within our own research spaces, right? They mean, historians, when they talk about colonization, like mean something completely different. And I think that's quite, what do you think?
Yeah, we also have done this for quite a few years. So the ability to be blunt was, and like both of us are quite blunt anyway. So that kind of worked when I kind of went off on a tangent and just kind of followed things. She would be like, no, enough, pull back, right? And when she kind of like splurted her theories at me and I didn't understand anything that she was saying, I would have to kind of be like, okay, explain again. And then I'd have to kind of think things through. So we just, that's kind of the, I guess, an openness to both disagree and agree on things and kind of find our way together through it. Because normally when you write with someone else, you write like different sections and then you kind of join together. And that didn't quite work with this one. We kind of had to write together.
Which I don't think we knew when we pitched it, right?
No,
we didn't. In our heads, we were writing separate sections when we pitched this.
Yeah.
And then we realized that we actually were going to have to weave a map to make this work. And it was good for me to learn how to take those big ideas and have to explain them in ways that make sense to people who haven't had to engage with them for the last 10 years. And it was good. I think you not in a bad way, just in a, I call Marcia a careful scholar. And I think she just says I run my mouth.
I wasn't gonna say it.
Yeah. I told it before I thought. But and so that in itself was quite, we did this over summer in Aotearoa, and it brought joy to have a reason to come together over summer. But it also had a few late night writing sessions and thinking sessions about what are we trying to say, how are we trying to say it, and which discipline gets it right. Which discipline gets to say it.
This is one of the hardest projects I think I've worked on because of that kind of needing to renegotiate the space continuously between us and the article. It was kind of like a continuous process right up to the end.
I think it's a really wonderful piece, and actually hearing you talk about it has really brought into focus for me how much came from that collaboration. I think one of the things about the piece that always struck me was that it's not organized the way a historian might conventionally organize that piece. But I think that and I can imagine that was a source, but I actually think that proves to be really brilliant. And especially seeing you talk about it today. Anyways, it really brought into focus how much was gained by breaking free of that disciplinary practice. So anyways, thank you very much. And thanks so much for such a great presentation. It was really wonderful.
Thank you, Dale. Also, I'm going to force you and Marcia to hang out a bit. You should have a historians who work with social scientists group.
Yeah, a support group. Yeah.
A drinking group, you mean?
Right. Are there any other questions people would like to ask?
Ooh, may I potentially ask a question?
Go ahead, Rodney.
Let's turn on my camera. There we go. Ooh, the lighting's better. My apologies. Yeah, I just have a general question, I guess, based on some of the things that you shared at the beginning, Dr. Naepi, around, I guess, talking about your metaphor on the mat. And I guess I just have a general question around what does it look like to support those who kind of create the mat? Since for those of us who are trained, and maybe this is conversations not for recorded Zoom, but there's time and place, but just thinking a lot about like what it means for like those of us who are like born away from the Vanua, or, outside, and like, put through the extruder of these different sort of disciplines. Like, what does it mean to come back to the land? And like, how do we sort of be in conversation with community in ways that don't, even, with good intentions, sometimes we might also accidentally replicate the kind of systems that we're trying to stop in the first place. So I guess just like a general question around that. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this presentation. So much to learn.
Thank you, Rodney. I think that that's something we wrestle with daily, and sometimes we get it completely wrong. Right, so there is a certain obligation of being Pacific in the academy that is tough, not just in Aotearoa and being Pacific in Aotearoa, and we earn like the disparity between us and our positions in our community here, and then also what does it mean to position ourselves with Indigenous knowledge systems from back there that we use to advance our positionality here. And these are, Marcia and I are going to try and write this summer, but it's a tough conversation to have because it means acknowledging privilege, it means acknowledging obligations, it means acknowledging some really tough tension, right? Because the people who gifted us this knowledge don't get that same privilege. And what makes us different from a white ethnographer? Which we've started those conversations, and we are different. I want to be really clear, we are different. But in what ways are we different? And those are tough conversations to have, I think, particularly at the beginning of a graduate journey. And I have to credit Sharon and Dale for a lot of time in UBC, listening to me kind of talk that through. And now I've replaced you with Marcia. But
and confirming I do have to listen to the runs.
Yes, but yeah, like how do we begin to articulate that tension? And I think there's something in the use of metaphor that helps us to articulate those tensions. And that's a little bit of, I think, Sharon, around the work that you do, and using metaphor and using cartographies to think about really tough conversations.
Yeah, I think all I want to add is this is a continuous process. I mean, we've both been doing this for a while, and daily, it's a thought daily. So definitely a continuous negotiated space.
And it's okay to get it wrong. I think you just have to know how to apologize, and not in a like, oh sorry, but in a meaningful way to your community. You have to know how to take, how we're accountable in a different way. And recognizing the cultural protocols around being held accountable.
Thanks. Thank you, Rodney, for your question. Sachi, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you so much, first of all, for the presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you. My question, you mentioned that education was sort of overtly, it was overtly recognized that education was used as a tool for conversion up until 1950, if I remember correctly. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like what changed in 1950 and what, if any, remnants you see of that today.
So in talking about 1950 is kind of the point where secondary education gets more attention in the Pacific from New Zealand. And that's because after World War II, there's a big economic boom globally, and there is a need to provide workers. And Pacific people were lured to New Zealand to fill jobs in factories and jobs as cleaners and stuff like that. And so they wanted people of the Pacific to be able to speak English through a required level. They wanted them to have basic kind of maths comprehension kind of thing. So they started fostering secondary education in the Pacific. And there is still that kind of remnant of New Zealand instilling the kind of educational policies in its Pacific empire that it still has. You know, the relationship that New Zealand has to the Cook Islands and to Niue is unusual relationship. I'm not sure if anyone is aware of it, but New Zealand and Niue and the Cook Islands are officially an associated statehood with New Zealand, which means that they hold New Zealand citizenship and they can vote in New Zealand elections and stuff like that. And there's kind of a free backwards and forwards. So New Zealand does still continuously benefit from this relationship that it's got. And it's got a old colonial boys club with Samoa that has this continuous fostering.
And like they shape our school, they shape the school curriculum there.
Yeah.
Like so it's weird to learn about kings and queens of England and Aotearoa. It's even weirder to learn about kings and queens of England and the Cook Islands, right? So that they shape the curriculum, and that's shifting a little bit. We've sort of talked on. I know the Cook Islands is looking at introducing a curriculum that's based on wayfinding and navigating, and how do you do that, and what does that look like? But how do you do that, and what does that look like, and still have it signed off by the authority that says that counts as an education system? Because you have to get a certain level at high school to be able to come to our universities, because you can't get a university in the Cook Islands. So it's this sort of, I think Joanna Kidman talked about it as existing within the shadow zone. So all of these sort of moments of internationalization and higher education for the Pacific, it kind of comes back to that initial throwing of a rock. And then you sort of have these big ideas, these big, like these different, it shatters out, and we have these different ramifications. Yeah.
And that's a really significant thing, having these kind of countries in the Pacific that are still steadily reliant on us for things like curriculum decisions. You know, they still do have those big conferences. That first one was held in 1926. They invite Pacific people now, but it's still dominated by New Zealand educators, very heavily dominated by it.
And you know, it's also dominated by New Zealand born Pacific.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. Yeah.
So that conversation that Rodney was just pointing to as well, it's dominated by people educated in New Zealand. So it's still the dominant. It's a space where a New Zealand education is still valued above everything else. You might get a keynote who's not New Zealand educated to kind of give us a bit of window dressing. Look, we're engaging. But the reality is that the people who get to sit at the table have a New Zealand education.
And within the Pacific themselves, this is a really significant idea, the division between those that are educated in the Pacific itself and those that are educated in New Zealand. I went to a graduation for a master's student on Saturday, and they opened the floor, as you do in Pacific events, you open the floor for anyone to come and speak. And an old uncle got up and started making a speech about how the graduate that she was educated in New Zealand, and compared it to his own journey in being educated in the Cook Islands. So that division is something that is very real for people within New Zealand's Pacific territories, and something that is applauded still.
So my in-laws family, my mother-in-law still holds it over my father-in-law that her family got chosen to go to the New Zealand school system. Right, it's still a point of comparison. So it is, and it's brought up like quite regularly all the time because it makes you better then, and that comes back to that initial moment of contact and knowledge systems and dismantling the value of our Pacific knowledge system. It means that I can go and talk about Fiji on an international stage, but someone who is educated at the University of South Pacific can't. Yeah. Not cool.
I have hi, my name's Christina Yao. I have more of a comment and just a note of appreciation for the work that you do. And also, like, I'm in my summer pandemic best and we're recording, but it's all right. I am located in the United States, and I mean, your piece is just really powerful and really important. I just want to say that you know, I think it's something that we especially in the United States, really need to learn from some of the work that you've been doing, and that you mentioned many other scholars in New Zealand have also done, is that, reconciling, expanding the definition of international education. And even your article, I think it's in the introduction, like that very first paragraph, you're like, we're expanding the definition of international education, right? I think here in the United States, especially, we think a lot about international ed as being very, very neutral, right? Without values, without any, like, it's just a thing, right? Internationalization is really important, and we have to do this, and it becomes neutralized, especially in our ways that we try to say. You talk about intercultural education and intercultural communication and global mindedness and all of those things, but we often don't reconcile with, the history, the historical aspect and everything. So I just want to say I really appreciate you bringing together the historical and the contemporary pieces, because like I tell my students all the time, when we talk about the history of higher ed in the United States, like, oh, it started with Harvard. I'm like, yes, but let's go back, right? Where did it come from, and how did this come, and all of that and stuff. So I really appreciate it, and I will be assigning it in my global issues class this fall. So you might get some of my students reaching out to you and giving some feedback, or just saying, hey, this was great and stuff. So I just want to say that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that. That's exciting to hear. Because we do, like, let's have those. Yeah, it's exciting. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
Are there other questions? Okay, I'll ask my question then, which is not very well formulated, I guess. And it's something that Siriana, you and I have talked about so many times, or like a version of it. But I guess it was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the and we've been talking a lot about tensions today, which is great. It's like my thing, and complexity. But, especially this tension between, like, wanting to critique this, like, the celebration of, like, the inclusion and access narrative that usually is, like, framed as some benevolent gift, as you say, of, like, the colonizing power. And, like, wanting to contrast that with, like, wanting to first point out the colonial nature of that, and also contrast it potentially with what a decolonizing approach would look like, but then also not necessarily wanting to, like, throw the baby out with the bathwater, at least right now, about the like access and inclusion piece, because until we have another possibility, for many people, it's the best option we have, and there's ways of doing that subversively and all that stuff. So just wondering, like, how you navigate those tensions in this piece specifically, or in general in your work, of, like, wanting to critique the inclusion, of the limits of inclusion, but then realizing that that can also be weaponized to take away some of the, like, bare minimum things that have been offered to.
There is some, like, that tension of complaining about the space is hard, right? Because we are sitting in the center of Pacific Studies within the Fale Pacifica complex. We have the most Pacific academics of any university. We are paid about 4 to 5 times the median income for Pacific women in this country. At the same time, we are paid 20% less than, oh, sorry, not 20%, that's just public services. We're paid on average about $7,000 less than our colleagues who are Pākehā male. We're promoted a lot less, even though we've done the same work. We rank our academics nationally, by the way, if you want to introduce a fun neoliberal measurement to Canada. Every 6 years you get a grade and you get ranked, yay. So using that data, we're underpaid, we're underpromoted, we're actually underrepresented nationally, and we shouldn't be proud to be employed the most specific, because it's still only 3% in this university. Our students are not achieving, when they're being underserved. So they're not achieving at the rate of everyone else. And even though Pacific pass rates have gone up, all students' pass rates have gone up, so the gap has remained the same. So how do you, those difficulties of, there was Pacific Grad last week, so the institution is investing in us, but it's investing us in very particular ways, right? Ways that make them look good, which is the conversation that we used to have a lot, Sharon, is how do you, biting the hand that feeds you puts you in quite a dangerous space. And then when we do speak publicly, we've just had a colleague get ridiculous amounts of racism. for speaking publicly about this, tied to you're already privileged, you have a full-time job and you get paid a lot of money. So I think it's something that similar to the answer we gave Rodney, where we test the line and how much we can complain, and sometimes it's too much and we step back. I think Marcia is my person that kind of goes, don't do it. It's going badly for you. Don't do it.
But I think my approach sometimes is a little too conservative.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm like, do it, and I push you off the off the edge because I'm like, do it. Tell them you're angry.
But we're also in a space where we're not indigenous to this country, yes, which adds a different level when we're talking about decolonization. And that's something that we've been talking about a lot, and something I think Pacific academics in this country are a little bit hesitant to talk about. So talking about being Pacific people and the benefits that we do get from this society in a settler colony is complicated.
We're not there yet. And I think that was one of the conversations. So we wrote another article with the Pacific Early Career Academics Network for our university, where we used your framework of the cartography of decolonization. And we really hope that our peers would recognize that our ability to get decolonization in this university is really limited. And we're not sure we got there. And so we want to write another article that kind of just owns that we can't do it. And part of the reason I think that there's a hesitation to own that is because then what are we doing? Right? There's that tension of we want to claim decolonial praxis, but how do you claim decolonial praxis as yes, we're Pacific and we have a connection to Māori, but we're only here because the settler government let us in. How do you claim that is Indigenous Pacific knowledge in this classroom decolonization when it's not our vanua, it's not our whenua, it's not our land, or is it something else? And I'm really kind of excited that Marcia is keen to have these conversations, because a lot of our colleagues are not keen, because it's sensitive as hell, and it hasn't always gone well.
No, and we can't have it by ourselves either. We have to have this with Māori. So yeah,
we're finding friends to be like, hey, do you want to have a tough conversation with us? It doesn't just say, yes, shut up.
Quite naturally.
Not joking. We have friends be like, just shut up, you're not doing that. And so that tension, I think, is not one that we can release anytime soon. But we're
exploring.
And we're trying to name it. I don't think the tension's been named yet, eh?
No, not at
like, we ain't. I came back from Canada ready to have some of these conversations, and very few people have accepted the invitation. And Marcia, I think, only accepted it because she's known me for so long and she can't get me out of the office now. I'm faculty, I'm allowed to just walk in here.
I also am in the School of Māori and Pacific Studies, so this is kind of like a daily kind of thought that I have about negotiating these spaces and what it means. Yeah.
And it's the School of Indigenous now, right, as well?
Is it? And I think that, well, there is an Indigenous program.
And how do you, we weren't really claiming Pacific as Indigenous knowledge till quite recently in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty recent for Pacific to start talking about Indigenous Pacific in New Zealand, Indigenous knowledge here. Yeah, because we still weren't colonized. and literally in those early migrations, right, in the 1950s, there are newspaper articles of Pacific people saying we weren't colonized. We have no allegiance to Māori because we weren't colonized. So there's that really, right? There's that really difficult history to work through. It's really easy for us, I think, to stand up and say that we're extended family and we all get along fine, but just like all extended family, there's some brutal conversations that are being ignored.
And there's been periods of history that have illustrated the disconnect between Māori and Pacific and Aotearoa that are not always talked about either. So.
Okay, well, this was wonderful. Thank you both so much, and thank you for the article. I realized I didn't put the link. I'm so sorry, but Google it. It's the same name as this presentation, and check out the other articles as well. But we were just so thrilled to have your piece in the special issue, and like we didn't want to pressure you, but we were like, take as much time as you need. Like,
thank you so much. Thank you so much for your patience. You're very, very generous to us.
We will look forward to following the future collaborations. And thank you again so much, everyone, for coming. And we'll see you at the next meeting in September.
Thank you.
Thank
And it's so
you.
good to see your faces again.
Bye.